All right, guys. So I have another one for you today. Let's talk about how testing constantly in your technique is going to destroy your lifts. Okay? Now, don't get me wrong. We have to make changes. We have to test things to get better. But so often I see athletes test with a poor testing strategy. They just have no idea how to run a test in technique, and that just destroys you. Here's a fun story that happens all the time to all of us, all of us coaches at least. And okay, I'm at fault when I was competitive as well, but we'll hear something, or we'll see something. Doesn't matter where. It could be a video online, could be in a podcast. It could be just watching somebody you admire lift, and you catch something, you see something and wonder, would that help me? And then you head into the gym, you make the change, and it depends. It depends how long you test it. But so often, especially for new athletes, the change they make affects them in a way that they don't realize, and then they forget that they made that change. So let's bring this all back together, okay, and go down a few key points of how we can test well. Because I don't want you to immediately go, okay, he's telling me not to test anything in lifting. That doesn't make sense, because we need to test. However, we need to test with a good testing strategy. So a good testing strategy, let's go down a couple points when we look at that. One, do you have a coach, right? Now, if you have a coach and something comes up, step one is to talk with your coach about it, okay? Approach your coach and go, hey, I saw X, Y, and Z, or I heard about this. Do you think that could be beneficial to me? Now, if you're with a good coach, they should be open to that conversation, right? They should be able to sit down and talk with you around the thoughts of what you are bringing to them. And maybe you saw an athlete you admire and they do a certain thing in their lift. They should be even able to talk about that athlete and why that might be beneficial to them, and whether or not it could be beneficial to you or not, right? It might just not be the right time in the big scheme of things to test it. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Just that step is to talk with your coach, right? So often athletes just make that adjustment thinking it doesn't matter. And then weeks down the line, the coach kind of cues in and goes, hey, why are you doing X? And the athlete kind of looks confused and they're like, oh yeah, well, I tried this a while back. I guess it just stuck. Now, hopefully that was a good change, but more than often it's not. So let that be step one. Say you don't have a coach. We're going to immediately go to step two, and that's documenting what you're changing. Write it down. So many athletes don't document what they're changing, and then they forget about it. They forget about it, and maybe pieces of the change stick, maybe they don't. And all of a sudden down the line, they just have these mixes of bad habits that they're not even aware or sure how they came about. So document it. And then the third step is have a set time period. A set time period that you're running this test, and that will help with your documentation. If I'm going to try to move my hands in the snatch, well, how long am I going to train that way before I make a decision whether it's good or bad? Okay, now this brings me to another point. Testing typically takes longer than you imagine. Right? So often I watch an athlete come in, they either have a change that they're thinking about making, or as a coach, you're asking them to make. They do it for a session, maybe 2 sessions, and then all of a sudden they're back to their old ways. And when you sit down with them, go, hey, I thought we were going to make this change and go after this, you hear, well, it didn't feel good. At what point do you think it's only going to be 2 days before it feels good? Now, don't get me wrong, some changes it'll be like, wow, that felt really good, right? But more than not, the changes that need to be made feel awkward, feel I love the definition, not right, or which we can get to that, right? If you're here learning, right, and you say the words, that doesn't feel right, how would you know what right feels like? Think about that. You're here learning, and obviously you're not on the world team or an Olympic team or anywhere near the goals that you've set. How would you know what right feels like? I'm sorry, that's a little soapbox. But back to it, looking at that testing period, right? And going, hey, I'm going to make this test for a month, 2 months. even 6 months. And that brings me to another story. 2012, Olympic Games, sitting in the Olympic Village next to Olympian Holly Mangold and Kendrick Ferris. They're discussing training. And the question comes up, what is their favorite body weight to train at? Now, as they're discussing it, Kendrick asked Holly, well, how long did you test the other body weight you trained at? And Holly responded, 2 months. And Kendrick shook his head and he said, no, you gotta at least test that for 6 months. So there's an example. There's an example of how long it might take to be able to accurately say this is good or bad for my technique. And I hope that story helps you, because so often you see athletes go 1 or 2 sessions and then they make the decision. So when you go in to test, when you go in to change, document, set a time period for testing. And if all of this is overwhelming you and you really have big goals in the Olympic lifts, get a coach and let a coach help you go through these changes and understand that process on the path to your goals. So I hope this conversation helps. I hope this brings some sense into your training, and good luck to you.